A site in Azerbaijan shattered by rivalry.
A whole city is forced to leave their homes.
A once socialist ruin in Estonia, founded by the ultimate capitalist.
He was known as Europe's Rockefeller.
A Sicilian utopia infiltrated by the Mafia.
Death, destruction, organized crime and corruption. What these people went through is harrowing.
And a Gothic horror in the American Midwest.
This seemingly old-world European castle became the very seed and cesspool of deviance.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. In the shadow of the Caucasus Mountains in Azerbaijan is a ghost town with a desolate past.
Nestling among green trees are hundreds of buildings, but they've been annihilated, with only their shells remaining.
It's an eerie sight. It looks like something out of a disaster movie. The roads and streets are deserted. There's no one to be seen anywhere. But there's this one building that survived.
The mosque gives a clue to the heritage of this place.
As does another unexpected find.
In the middle of all this rubble is a beautiful painted mural. Maybe it foreshadows some kind of revival of this shattered city.
What disaster struck this once bustling city and displaced over 500,000 civilians from this remote region? The disputed territory of Karabakh is difficult to access. Here, war correspondent Amin Ibrahimov knows only too well the dangers that come with his job.
In October 2020, I was covering the Karabakh war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Fortunately, I had a dash cam that was able to capture everything. One day, I got a chance to go to a village that was just recently liberated, and it was going to be an exclusive. I was supposed to be the first journalist to go there. So I took my car, and on the way, I saw a rocket just in front of me. Passed just above the car, and I felt an impact, a shockwave from the impact just behind me.
Amin was caught up in a war that has plagued this part of the world for many years.
So that's when I realized that I was attacked, and the first thing that came to my mind was the questions: how long will it take the guy to reload and shoot again? So I really stepped on it, trying to go as fast as I can without losing control of the car. The next thing I know, maybe 30 seconds later, I was already in the village. I found some cover, got out of the car, and it's probably only then that I realized that I just barely escaped death.
Amin will never forget the exact spot where his life so nearly came to a sudden end.
So this is where it happened. The rocket was fired from the top of that hill. And these magnetic stickers with the logo of the channel were on both sides of the car. They got blown away by the shockwave.
It's shocking just how close they came to being hit by a rocket. It goes to show just how dangerous of an environment it is for ordinary people in the area.
The border region of Karabakh has been the center of a dispute in a tug of war between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
In the last 3 decades alone, the conflict has taken tens of thousands of lives, yet it's still relatively unknown.
People didn't hear much about this conflict the way they do about conflicts in other regions. It happened in an area that most Westerners don't know much about, and between 2 groups of people who are often overlooked by history.
Whole cities were annihilated in 2 bloody wars in the early 1990s and 2020, and it has left a deadly legacy.
Today you can only travel on the main roads because of the danger of the mines. If you want to step off the main road, you actually have to have a team of deminers check the area before you do.
This region was once riddled with nearly 100,000 mines.
We're on the central square of the most popular place amongst city residents. Behind me used to be City Hall, and this building, or what is left of it, used to be a drama theater, which was built in the 50s. It was the cultural center of the region.
You wouldn't believe that this was once a thriving, bustling city with people living normal lives here.
Amid the rubble is a stark reminder of those who lived here.
The beautiful mural depicts 3 attributes of Azerbaijani culture. The woman is holding a tray with the symbols of Nowruz holiday. A singer is holding a saz, an Azeri instrument. And a woman with a child is wearing a shawl called kelagai. All 3 are protected by UNESCO and are parts of the intangible heritage of the humanity.
This is the Azerbaijani city of Agdam, once the cultural hub of the region.
Agdam was a very modern, progressive city for this area. Any Westerner could have strolled through the streets and visited the cafes and felt right at home. And yet, all of that was swept away in a relatively short period of time.
The mural adorns a once celebrated museum.
The building behind me used to be a bread museum. It had over 1,500 exhibits, and one of the most interesting ones was a piece of bread that was brought back from the space by the astronauts. The building was shelled in 1992, and now there's only 3 walls remaining.
Until 1991, Agdam and the region known then as Nagorno-Karabakh had been under Soviet control for over 70 years.
During the Soviet era, Nagorno-Karabakh was a part of the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan. But 77% of the area's population were Armenians, and they naturally wanted the area to come under the control of the Soviet Republic of Armenia.
As it did in other republics that it controlled, the USSR was able to enforce a kind of peace in this sometimes fractious region.
But as the collapse of the Soviet Union looked imminent, tensions began to rise.
This is a common thing we see when a superpower controlling regional, nationalistic, ethnic groups in some kind of harmony, when that superpower recedes, all those tensions and conflicts and divisions can flare up again.
With guns at the ready, Agdam was at the flashpoint between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
In 1993, Armenia was convinced that Azerbaijan was about to launch an offensive, and they quickly reacted.
Thousands of Armenian troops tore through Agdam and shelled the city to smithereens. The skeleton Azerbaijani army had no chance against a force this big.
It was an incredibly bloody and heartbreaking affair for the residents.
40,000 of the city's population and 500,000 Azerbaijanis in the region were forced to leave their homes.
And it wasn't just the fighting taking civilian lives.
Not everyone got out safely. Some residents fled to nearby forests, and in the harsh winter, quite a few froze to death.
By 1994, Armenia had captured the region, including the city of Agdam.
Yet one building somehow survived it all.
The only building that was still standing was an old mosque built in the 1870s. Armenians actually used it as an observation tower, a barn, and to correct the artillery fire.
The Armenians had controlled Agdam since 1993. Although the city sat deserted for more than 25 years, neighboring Azerbaijan kept it in its sights.
The Azerbaijan army wanted to retake terrain that had been lost in the 1990s conflict. And then in 2020, the conflict ignited again.
While the rest of the world was dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, Nagorno-Karabakh was dealing with another battle, a war that raged in the region for 44 days.
This conflict has since been recognized as a significant moment in military history.
This is thought of as the first war in history in which drones played a critical role in its outcome.
Azerbaijan's drone-led assault scored a decisive victory, and by November 2020, Agdam was back in their hands. But for the city's residents, the struggle is not over.
The guns may have fallen silent, but it's still a traumatic time for civilians on both sides. For the Azerbaijanis, who can't return to their homes, and for the Armenians, who have once again had to be uprooted.
Agdam remains derelict, but something surprising has survived the carnage, giving hope for its future.
There's hardly anything left of Agdam, but one thing incredibly is still alive: the city's football team. They play in the Azerbaijan football leagues, but now based, of course, in the nation's capital, Baku.
The fact that they're still existing as a team associated with the city shows you that there's a hope that this city will come back to life.
There's a chance they'll be able to play in Agdam again, as the government announced plans to turn the ghost town into a super-modern metropolis.
The master plan of a new Agdam has been approved in May 2021, and the renewed city will have a population of 100,000 people.
On the outskirts of downtown Kansas City, Missouri, is a curious structure that looks like it doesn't belong.
This is a modern metropolis, lots of people, great jazz, even better barbecue, and yet on the edge of this very modern Midwestern city is this castle that looks like it's been plucked out of the 1600s.
It seems completely out of place. It seems not only to be in the wrong time period, but to be in the wrong continent.
This ruined castle isn't out in the moors of Scotland somewhere. It's in Kansas City, Missouri.
Inside, modern features hint at the true age of the stone fortress.
Looks like it could be hundreds of years old. Then you notice the steel beams holding parts of it up. So clearly it's somewhat more recent than the castles of Scotland.
Yet, the neglected remains give few clues about the original purpose of the building.
The windows are boarded up, there's graffiti on the walls.
There's trees growing out of the ruins, the roof is missing. Clearly this building has been unoccupied for a very long time.
This is a place that is stripped bare of human habitation. And yet, the graffiti, the signs and symbols show that at one time, people did live here. Who were they?
Property developer Vieweiser Dixon is breathing life back into this building.
I remember as a child growing up here, I was a little afraid of that building because that was where they kept some of the bad guys.
Viewweiser is the current owner. When he was young, though, the building was already abandoned.
But I had friends that went over there, you know, and they'd come back and tell cool stories, like the place was haunted, you know, different things like that. But I wouldn't go. Mom said, you know, you don't want to go over there.
The origins of the bizarre castle can be traced to an era when alcohol was considered the scourge of America, and to a particular quirk of Kansas City's geography.
When you go back to the late 1800s, around 1881, you've got two Kansas cities, and you still do to this day. You've got Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas, and they're split by the Missouri River.
Kansas outlawed alcohol in 1881, almost 40 years before the federal law went into effect. That made Kansas a dry state. It also made Kansas City, which is right next door in Missouri, a very popular place for all kinds of people who wanted to have a good time. There were bars and brothels and entertainment joints, and people came from all over.
And so they would just hang around, you know, and get in trouble with the police.
This is what eventually led to the demise of Kansas City's reputation.
With all these changes, it becomes a center for crime, petty crime, and vagrancies. And the authorities at the time just didn't have the resources that they needed to take care of the problems.
As crime soared, the police had nowhere to house the drunks and drifters now littering the city's streets. The solution was this: the Kansas City Workhouse. Its doors first opened in 1897.
This was the front entrance going into the administrative side to be admitted into the prison. This whole area right here was basically where they kept about 100 men. All this area right here.
Technically, this is not a prison, it's a workhouse. And the concept of a workhouse goes back centuries. The idea is that someone who's a petty criminal or simply very poor and homeless could be sent to this place where they work their way back to society. They perform labor. And in fact, the Kansas City Workhouse worked inmates a lot.
Pretty much, if you were down on your luck, you were pretty safe to come here and try to get back on the feet because they had programming to do that for those that needed it.
Sometimes this work was functional and had an economic benefit for the prison managers. But sometimes work would be manufactured that had no purpose except to employ labor in.
The prison itself was quarried by prisoners themselves. They cut the rock. I know if you've heard working on the chain gang, well, they quarried all the yellow limestone that this particular building and other buildings around Kansas City were built in. So they had hard labor.
Yet none of this explains why a facility to house petty criminals looked like a medieval castle.
When you think about it, the Kansas City Workhouse Castle is kind of an oxymoron. A workhouse is a place for criminals or the destitute, and a castle is a place for the aristocracy. But here in Kansas City, they put them together.
When you hit the late 1800s in Kansas City, you have this tendency to kind of romanticize the idea of architecture and want to go back to old European style architecture. So that when they're sitting down to design this prison, the idea is, well, what's more European than a castle?
The workhouse, originally built on the ideals of reform and rehabilitation, offered inmates a route back to society. But any misbehavior was severely dealt with.
If you acted up, in the program, some kind of way. They would put you in solitary confinement. If you come here, you'll see actual prison bars that's still standing today. So I'm thinking that could have been where you had to stay if you got really bad. I wouldn't want to be put in no cell like that. You know, if you close that door, you were in there by yourself.
But before long, the supposed reformatory was surrounded by controversy.
The workhouses have been created to prevent deviance, but they became the very seed and cesspool of deviance.
Under the stewardship of those trusted to help vulnerable prisoners, it quickly transformed into a den of inequity.
The superintendent of the workhouse was a man by the name of Patrick O'Hearn. He was particularly corrupt and so didn't run a very tight ship.
From what I hear, a lot of illicit activities going here. If you were a prisoner and if you was a big gangster or if you was somebody, you could get all the kind of drug paraphernalia, maybe a woman or two.
This was not a great environment to rehabilitate these petty criminals or alcoholics or homeless people. It was dirty, the food was bad, it was easy to get your hands on drugs or alcohol. So as a social experiment in rehabilitation, you can't say it was a success.
Things got so bad that the mayor of Kansas City opened up an investigation in 1909. And after that investigation, they very quickly fired the superintendent.
2 years later, the male inmates were moved to a newly built workhouse farm less than 10 miles away. The female prisoners remained, but the Kansas castle's days as a reformatory were coming to an end.
Despite the changes that were put into place after 1909, things just weren't going well. And so by 1924, they completely shut down the castle and inmates were sent to other places.
As often happens with old prisons or other abandoned public buildings, they found a few other uses for it over the years. They used it for storage for a while. It was used as a Marines training facility for a while, but it was finally completely abandoned in the 1970s.
For decades, the castle stood empty, filled with graffiti and broken windows and all sorts of trouble, just a horrible space.
That was until Viewweiser stepped in with big plans to transform the castle and build new homes on the land, creating fresh opportunities for local people.
This particular building, we want to make it into a boutique hotel where you can come here and have a different kind of a wow experience. I'm the steward of the land. The promised land is what we call it. A place where we can live, work, and play for entrepreneurs.
In Sicily's Belice Valley are the remains of a bold architectural statement.
It looks like the whole town was just dropped onto the landscape, completed one day.
The angles are brutal. It feels strikingly modernist.
It isn't completely empty, but it's very close to it.
On a hillside just a few miles to the north lies another sprawling ruin.
Narrow, winding streets, a crumbling church. This is, or at least it was, a traditional Sicilian town.
It's as if a bomb went off. Bang!
It's completely devoid of life, except for the occasional stray dog hunting around the streets.
These strikingly different towns share the same name.
They must be connected, but it's hard to see how.
It began with an unavoidable tragedy, but it ended with something much more insidious.
Girolamo Cangelossi has lived in Poggio Reale since it was built. He has been the town's mayor for 4 years.
Questa piazza è stata disegnata dall'architetto Paolo Portoghese di... Ogni tanto lo utilizzavamo per ricevere queste compagnie teatrali del territorio siciliano che hanno portato avanti il ruolo della nostra cultura siciliana e quindi questo posto è pensato e costruito per aggregare la società di Poggio Reale.
The unifying vision behind the central square was part of an ambitious plan for the entire town.
Instead of being densely packed and with narrow streets, it would have wide boulevards and large open communal spaces.
The circular streets were the nuclei of the town, and each was supposed to have a significant building in the center. Public services were going to be more easily accessible and more available to everyone who lived in there.
All of these different design concepts and ideas they hoped would come together to bring the residents into the modern world.
You might think that this is all a good idea, but as you can see, it didn't work out so well.
The story of how this once visionary settlement became a faded memory begins with the sprawling ruin 2 miles north. This is the original town of Poggio Reale. Calogero Petralia was born here in the 1950s and spent his childhood among its once busy streets.
E questa è la scuola elementare. Vicino alla scuola c'era il teatro comunale. Ci facevamo anche le serate per carnevale.
But now the heart of the town is strictly off limits to the public.
Quindi non possiamo andare oltre perché è pericoloso.
The walls look like they could come down at any moment. The floors look like they could collapse at any moment. To this day, it's a complete death trap.
On the 14th of January 1968, the destruction began.
È incominciata a mezzogiorno. Stavamo per andare a tavola e è successo che è tremato un po' il tavolino e i bicchieri. Persone anziane che ci ha detto questo è terremoto e abbiamo incominciato ad abbandonare il paese.
But the fiercest tremor was to come later that evening. By then, many of the town's residents had already fled to the countryside.
Era buio nel mese di gennaio. Quindi aspettavamo la notte, facevamo dei falò, chi si abbracciava ai figli e chi si abbracciava ai padri. Quindi qua era una paura totale perché nessuno sapeva che cosa succedeva. Quando è fatto il giorno si è cercato di andare a constatare i danni.
Houses collapsed and the town was destroyed in mere instants.
In addition to the damage, 3 people lost their lives. But that was just the start of Poggio Reale's suffering.
Death, destruction, organized crime and corruption. What these people went through is harrowing.
The danger doesn't cease when the earthquake stops. The aftermath can be just as devastating.
Overnight, the entire population of the town became homeless. The government relief effort was slow, disorganized, and underfunded.
Eventually, temporary housing was set up for the residents, but it was only tents and prefabricated barracks.
Finally, they came up with a plan to permanently rehouse the victims in an entirely new city, built just down the hill.
But you wouldn't believe just how long it would take.
Not a single house was built until 1976, which is 8 years after the earthquake.
And there's only one thing that can explain that: corruption.
It appeared that the money earmarked for the reconstruction of the town had been siphoned off into the pockets of politicians and the Mafia.
The first residents moved into the new town in 1982. 14 years after the earthquake. Girolamo was one of the first to arrive.
È stato per me una nuova rinascita perché avevamo le stanze più ampie, avevamo la nostra stanza, perché in baracca stavamo tutti in una stanza, tutta la famiglia.
Beyond simply rehousing people, the architects were promoting a social vision.
The futuristic design of the town was intended to bring the inhabitants into the modern world.
But the dream failed to become reality.
That simply didn't line up with what the people of Poggio Reale needed.
The people wanted investment in the economy. They wanted jobs rather than money being poured into this new town that was really more of a work of art than anything else.
Work on Poggio Reale was completed in the 1990s. The Italian government spent several $1 billion on reconstruction across the region.
It had the capacity to house 10,000 people, but it never saw a fraction of that.
Many of the residents never made it to the new town just because they had to wait long periods of time before being able to move back home, and so they just decided to locate elsewhere.
And the town's fortunes haven't improved much since.
Today, we see these homes selling for a pittance, because really, who wants to move into a town that's dying?
Today, Girolamo hopes to improve the fortunes of the town.
Quando mi sono candidato per fare il sindaco di Poggio Reale, mi sono candidato per essere al servizio della mia cittadina e dare servizi più importanti alla nostra collettività.
The old town, though, has not been forgotten and is a key factor in this area's newfound popularity.
Despite the lofty vision of the new town, today it's actually the old town that is proving far more attractive, with thousands of tourists coming every year to get a glimpse of the broken streets and dilapidated houses.
In the Baltic country of Estonia, a red brick megastructure sits eerily out of place.
The complex is huge. You have buildings spread across this island and then spilling out onto the banks of the mainland.
Through the large windows, rays of sunlight pour in on a sunny day. Huge empty rooms with rows upon rows of decaying pillars.
But these now peaceful halls belie a troubled history.
The working and living conditions were brutal. Corpses were being carried all over the streets.
What went on here in these buildings would be more associated with another land.
This enormous structure was once referred to as a bit of England on Russian ground. But what's the connection here to England?
And how did the seeds of the world's biggest ever revolution come to be sown here? This place is on the island of Kreenholm, and it sprawls across the border between two nations.
One part of the complex is in Estonia, and the other part is in Russia.
Here, architectural restoration expert Madis Tudor studies its origins.
Но эта архитектура очень похожа на фабрику Англии. Английский дух чувствуется.
It was built in the 1850s. This date gives a clue about why this English-style building ended up here. Back then, northern Britain was covered in similar structures, built to house the cotton mills that grew out of the Industrial Revolution. But industrialization had not yet reached the Russian Empire, although that would soon change.
In 1856, a wealthy German merchant named Baron Ludwig Knoop bought Kreenholm Island. He was known as Europe's Rockefeller.
He founded 200 cotton mills in Russia, England, and the United States. But Kreenholm was going to be his crowning glory.
The Kreenholm factory complex was built for one purpose: to produce cotton.
Kreenholm was the most modern textile factory in the Russian Empire and the largest in Europe.
At its peak, the factory would house nearly 500,000 spindles. This accounted for 10% of all the cotton cloth production in the entire Russian Empire.
Knoop had lived and worked in industrial Britain. Drawing on what he'd seen there, he filled his latest factory with state-of-the-art technology.
Это техника, оборудование в основном сюда они привезли из Англии, из Германии. Так что и это оборудование было довольно современное, довольно такое новаторское, скажем так, и в свое время, ну, как первое слово, скажем так.
The new technology wasn't limited to the cotton mills.
Premises were heated by hot water and steam, and there was illumination through gaslight, as well as a ventilation system. By 1889, there was even a telephone system installed.
The complex grew to accommodate the thousands who came to work here. Kreenholm became a town in its own right.
И здесь были свои школы, детсадики, больницы для рабочих, свои пекарни, даже можно сказать, что свой денег.
Kreenholm was more than just a factory. It was so large, it operated more like a city-state.
But life here was far from easy.
Работающие не были довольны с условиями. Ну, как обычно, маленькая зарплата, некоторые директора не нравились, просто хотели лучших условий. И стали тогда протестировать, значит.
Kreenholm had become fertile ground for a bitter revolution.
The Russian Empire is one of the last places in Europe to industrialize. They do it very quickly, and they do it on a massive scale. So, small surprise, there are issues with work conditions, workers' health.
Kreenholm also used child labor from an orphanage in St. Petersburg.
In its heyday, you would not have wanted to be one of the workers here. It was absolutely brutal.
В основном рабочие пришли сюда из эстонских хуторов. Эти условия здесь были довольно сложные, потому что это температура, вибрация, шум, пыль, потому что пыль это может быть самый такой серьезный.
Despite their horrifying treatment, the peasants of the feudal Russian Empire had not yet challenged the system. At Kreenholm, that was about to change. And it was an outbreak of a disease that fueled the unrest.
A devastating and terrifying cholera epidemic broke out in Estonia in 1872. Many of Kreenholm's workers fell ill, and about 400 of them died.
Corpses were being carried through Kreenholm in full view of the factory's population, and it must have been grim, wondering if you would be the epidemic's next victim.
Workers were terrified of catching the infection themselves, but they're pleased to leave Kreenholm, which was really a perfect petri dish for the spread of the disease. Those pleas fell on deaf ears.
The employees were left in a desperate situation.
As a measure to prevent catching cholera, workers would open the windows, but it became so cold that it was very difficult to work.
In August 1872, they decide enough is enough, and they go on strike.
When the factory's internal police force got involved, it turned into a riot.
it kick-started a violent confrontation between the employers and the workers.
Конечно, вызывали армию, чтобы успокаивать народу, но в то время это было, ну, может быть, даже говорят, что самая большая скачка в России.
Troops were called in and were met with stones being thrown at them by the workers.
The epidemic triggered the most serious labor unrest that Russia and Estonia had ever seen.
They eventually managed to quell the unrest, and the factory kept on rolling.
At the turn of the 20th century, an 8-hour working day was introduced, and life for the workers became a little bit easier. The factory thrived.
But the fires of dissent had been lit in the Russian Empire.
Конечно, влияло в этом плане, что и в других городах, где были промышленные города, например, и Санкт-Петербург сам тут рядом, и, конечно, влияло, что народ стал смелее требовать что-то от государства или от этих директоров.
Ultimately, riots around the empire, like Kreenholm's, led to the 1917 Russian Revolution that not only spelt the end of the Russian Empire, but also changed the world. Estonia broke away from Russia, but the island's cotton factories carried on producing.
By the First World War, the factory was employing 10,000 people, producing 17.5 tons of yarn and almost 47,000 miles of fabric a year.
In 1940, Estonia became part of the Russian Empire once more, only this time under Soviet rule.
At its height in the 1970s, the plant covered 32,000 acres and employed 12,000 people. When Estonia regained its independence, Kreenholm was privatized, but the company continued to lose money. The number of its workers dwindled over the years until in 2010 it went bankrupt.
Вот это последний станок. Все остальные увезли в металлолом после закрытия фабрик. Так что это все, что осталось от оборудования.
The Kreenholm factory complex maintains its place at the vanguard of revolution.
In retrospect, the speed and conditions of industrializations there were creating a sort of perfect mix for political radicalism to spread. And you can see the origins of that, or at least a foreshadowing of it, in what happened at Kreenholm.